Black Star. There was a donut shop that Will had been going to. It was about 12 blocks from his house. It took him right through the center of Parkdale. It was a nice walk, very colorful, especially at night. There were a lot of streetwalkers in Parkdale. That's what Robert called them. Will had never heard the expression before. There weren't very many in his neighborhood in Ottawa. A streetwalker was a prostitute, with or without a pimp. The walk to the donut shop was like an open market bazaar, but instead of selling linens and seeds and nuts and fruits and dried figs, like an open market in Morocco, most of the sales requests were for sex or drugs on the way to the donut shop. Just about any kind of drug you could imagine. Street drugs or from a pharmacy was all there for the open purchase. It had started to settle in on Will, how different Toronto was from Ottawa. Ottawa was a tiny little city full of upper middle class people working for a completely stable federal government. The disparity between the two cities was astounding, and the particular neighborhood that Will was living in compounded the issue. The donut shop was near the Mental Health Institute. Sometimes Will would sit in there for an hour or two with a couple of coffees, reading a book, and watching the nurses and doctors and the patients come in and get what they wanted. On this day, he ordered his usual black coffee and found the last table to sit at. He pulled out an envelope he had put in his pocket that morning. It had been waiting for him in the vestibule. He assumed it came in the general mail, and Mrs. Duncan left it out for him. Before he could start to read the letter, he had to address a woman. She was giving him a look he had become accustomed to in the neighborhood. It was a death look, a direct and unblinking gaze that locked onto him. The person who owned the gaze was an old woman with black hair streaked with gray and a wrinkled, prune-like face. She literally looked like the caricature of an Eastern European witch. It was usually the hardcore psychotics who stared into him that way. He didn't know if they did it to other people, but it sure happened to him quite a bit. Oftentimes the same people would turn up that night in his dreams. Perhaps it was just because economics had become something of an overriding motif in his philosophy. He likened what they were doing to an attempted withdrawal, a withdrawal of energy from him, maybe a moment of sympathy, poor soul, anything in which his eyes passed something to their eyes, and something was taken from him and given to them. He wasn't going crazy. There was a very real economy to this. The power of this old woman's need was overwhelming. Will felt assaulted, but there was nothing he could do. All space is violated under overwhelming need. You cannot keep a drowning person off a lifeboat by telling them all the seats are occupied. Any kind of property is communal when need is overwhelming. Her eyes were black and piercing. Her inner world had collapsed. He had nothing for her, and he actually felt a little guilty for not having anything he could show through his eyes, that she might feel for a moment. But there wasn't a scent of compassion in him. Something about the month and a half in the community had whittled him back a little bit. He wondered if this is what it was like when Siddhartha left the temple in India, although he didn't liken himself to the Buddha. But he did become aware of the fact that his understanding of what was normal in life and what other people's understanding of what was normal were completely different things. He had been entirely entitled. She broke her stare, stood, and left the donut shop. Empty-handed, empty-hearted, nothing from Will. He returned to his black coffee and his letter, which was from his sister in New York. His parents were starting to use the expression mental breakdown, and after that, nervous exhaustion in their communications with his sister, who they knew was in communication with him. She was doing her best, being the big sister, to give him the space that he needed, and she was holding off their parents by telling them, no, he's fine, just let him be. He needs this time, just let him be. And Will was grateful for that, although he was a little disturbed to hear the prognosis back home in Ottawa. He was interrupted by Persephone Bleuette, whom he had known but forgotten. Is this seat taken? She pointed to the other seat at his table. Will took a quick look around. There were no other seats. He said it was not. He wasn't trying to be rude, you just had to be awake in that neighborhood. Percy said she didn't think the streetcar would be around for a while, so she had decided to have a coffee. He still didn't recognize her. He guessed that she was about 20, but she groomed herself, at least when she went to work at the hospital, like a middle-aged woman. She pulled her hair back in a bun, which made her face look very austere. It was the first thing he noticed, how serious she looked. After he took a good look at her, He decided that she was beautiful, not in a model-like way. No, she was just beautiful, demure, good skin, delicate features. So he said, "No, not at all, please sit down." She recognized him first. "You look very familiar," she said. He told her that he was in the donut shop quite a bit. She said that wasn't it. She knew him from somewhere else. The first thing that came to his mind was university, so he asked her if she had ever lived in Ottawa. She had, and it turned out they had both gone to the University of Ottawa. She remembered that they took the same second-year humanities elective, sociology, and were in the same section. She said she remembered him because he was the only one in the class that looked as young as her. He had started university when he was 16, after skipping a couple of grades, he told her. So had she. In fact, they'd both skipped the second grade. He asked her what she thought they might have missed, and she thought that was really funny. She repeated it several times, what we might have missed, and laughed each time. That was the only thing she laughed about. The rest of the time she was intensely calm. They introduced themselves. She was Percy, short for Persephone, and he was Will, short for William. She spoke quickly and succinctly, never hesitating or pausing, like she'd written down what she was going to say. It was a script. He understood. He used to live on a script as well. She asked him what he was doing, and he said, "Just hanging out." She said, "No, not this instant, in general." He said, "Yeah, I know, just hanging out." She looked quizzically at him. "You're not going to school?" "No." She glanced around the donut shop, then leaned in a little closer to him. "That woman that left just before I sat down is my ward." "Excuse me?" Will said. "That old woman. She's been court-ordered to psychiatric evaluation. She stabbed a courier in her front hall." Will winced. "Did she kill him?" "No, he's fine. The blade only went in 1/4 of an inch." "Why did she do it?" Will asked. "We don't know yet," Percy said. Will nodded, as though he had joined some conspiracy. She circled back to what she called Will's gap year. What was he doing in Parkdale? If he was going to take a year off school, why not go to Europe? He had the means. Will didn't really have any answers to her questions. He just said, "I don't know. I just wanted to come somewhere and be alone." She decided not to think about it anymore and took the opportunity to divest herself of a lot of stuff that had been on her chest. She told him that she had been accepted into graduate studies that commenced in the fall. She was doing a co-op at the mental health center, extracurricular. Will asked her if she knew anything about schizophrenia. He had spoken at length with Robert Polsky about it at the Dolphin, and Robert had told them that they didn't have a clue what it was. They could tell the characteristics, but they couldn't define the disease. It was a lot like electricity. Percy told Will that little was really known, but it was a great topic for a thesis. She couldn't quite believe that he was doing nothing, so he told her he was interpreting a vision. She didn't blink an eye. She just said, "Uh-huh." Will saw the scars on Percy's wrists when she was holding her coffee with both hands. It couldn't have been much past 6 months since she tried to kill herself, going by the tender look to the skin. He was dumbfounded by the scars. The idea of Percy trying to kill herself was horrifying to him. She seemed so valuable somehow. He didn't really know her, had hardly remembered her until she reintroduced herself, but he couldn't imagine a world without her at that moment. It just made him sad that she had ever wanted to die. He tried his best not to get caught staring at the scars. "What are the characteristics of a vision?" she asked. "My vision or a vision? I would think you more qualified to answer the latter." "I deal with delusions and hallucinations," she said, and she used those words like she had no doubts about what they meant. "Well, if you don't know what a vision is, how do you know the difference between a delusion and a vision?" Will asked her. She was caught off guard and stared out the window for a couple of seconds, then at him. Then she started to speak at length, as though it was some kind of Catholic confessional, and it just all came pouring out. Will would later think that the first few questions were just some kind of test. She told him all about her co-op at the hospital. It was eerie quiet at night. Early in the morning was one of those times that was super creepy, just before the loons woke up and remembered they were insane. They could forget they were insane when they slept. "Everyone is sane when they sleep," Percy said. She told him that the human interior could not be understood. It was the great humbling they all went through. Doctors did the best they could. It didn't matter how many ways they devised to see activity in the brain. They never understood it. She qualified her position as realistic, not cynical. Will nodded his head. He was just happy for the conversation. He knew nothing about mental health. Percy went on with her lengthy debriefing, and that was how he characterized it later when he was walking home. A debriefing. It was like she had been sitting on all this stuff, just waiting for an opportunity to unload it all, and Will was the person she chose. Probably because they had so many things in common, including skipping the 2nd grade. How many times do you bump into someone randomly who has that much in common with you? It was all reasonable. She wasn't neurotic. He could understand it. The feelings she had walking the hospital halls at night were overwhelming. It was her first exposure to the workings of this kind of an institution. She thought she was going to have a nervous breakdown. She couldn't look the patients in their eyes. There was no relationship between them. So many of them were court-ordered. The whole thing was fueled on expedience and the continuous deferral of the liability involved in making a decision. In lieu of a decision, the staff was allowed to observe, and they were allowed to recommend further observation by other observers in other places. They could keep a person in the system for weeks or months without having to account for their actions and say, "We don't know," at the end of it all. Will wondered why she was working in the mental health field if she didn't like it. It was her mother's profession. Percy's mother was one of the most respected psychiatrists in Toronto, a leader in the field of premenstrual syndrome, with a small portion of her practice devoted to counseling as a condition of parole. Those were the patients her mother liked the best. She felt like she was really doing something when she worked with the lost souls who found themselves in the Canadian justice system. Percy, however, was having some kind of reaction to the profession. She had begun to wonder if pure research might not be a better choice for her. Some childish concessions she had made to her heart that now had to be released. It was all just part of growing up, she suspected, but still, the feelings she had walking those halls at night. There was so much suffering. Every kind of pain known to humanity was on display. It was very humbling, she said. She had been away from the University of Ottawa a while. Her mother had chartered her summer, extracurricular work for future applications. Percy was monitoring the effects of a new drug 3 days a week, a drug called Zolfax, a drug that stopped outbursts, certain forms of mania in schizophrenics. It worked. It worked just fine. The problem was that it didn't do anything to heal the affliction. In fact, so much of mental health was just a stopgap solution. Drug therapy was a never-ending revenue stream for pharmaceutical companies and healthcare professionals. Percy was not overwhelmed with disgust or self-loathing or any other feeling of defeat by these realizations. The patients needed respite from their suffering. It was just that sometimes it seemed a great injustice could be happening, but she had no proof. It was just a feeling. Mrs. Rubini, the woman who had left the donut shop after staring through Will for a few minutes, was her main study in the extracurricular work she was doing at the institution. The hospital had made room for Percy because her mother had made inquiries at the highest levels, and because Percy came for free, and her work would be turned over to Zolfax's parent company, where it would be mined for the rhetoric to fill the government forms that regulated their industry. Mrs. Rubini's case was interesting. She had started to clean her home in the middle of the night. Her husband had thought this behavior was a little strange and asked her not to do it. Still, he'd wake up to the sound of the vacuum cleaner at 3 a.m. Their 3 children were grown and no longer lived at home. Mr. Rubini's first thought on his wife's strange behavior was that she had been deeply affected by the engagement of their youngest child and had started to express this in her odd practices. Long story short, the cleaning fetish led to the stabbing of a UPS courier for getting a little bit of slush on the runner in her vestibule, and Mrs. Rubini landed at the Queen Street Mental Health Center under the observation of Persephone Bleuette. Small world. Mrs. Rubini had been diagnosed with a kind of dementia that was broad, but perfect for Zolfax. Under the medication, she had not tried to clean the hospital. In her family sessions with Percy and a senior physician at the hospital, she showed some awareness of how strange her behavior had been. The drug was effective and there were no impediments to her release. She would be prescribed Zolfax and it would cost her family about $600 a month. The prescription would be lifted when there was enough evidence that the ailment, never cured, never really defined, passed on its own. Percy took a big gulp of her coffee, and then the first significant silence since she began talking settled in around them. Will felt awkward after a few moments, and he said, "Do you believe in God?" Percy furrowed her brow and looked at him like he was an alien. She didn't say a word. "I think God's an economist," Will said. End of chapter.